This slide is showing fetal circulation. So we know that the most important thing that the yolk sac does in humans is to provide the first blood cells. So by the end of week 3, the embryo has a system of paired vessels, and these two vessels forming the heart have fused and are bent into an S shape. And that heart is going to begin to beat at only 3.5 weeks. So we're going to talk about these unique vascular modifications that occur because during prenatal development, some modifications have to be present and they're occluded at birth. So we have umbilical arteries and umbilical veins, and also a series of shunts. Now, when we talk about the umbilical arteries and the umbilical veins, these are opposite of what we've learned for most arteries throughout the body. You know that the majority of arteries carry oxygenated blood, but remember a couple exceptions are those pulmonary blood vessels, also the umbilical blood vessels. So, what that means is that this umbilical artery is taking deoxygenated blood away from the fetal heart. So remember, what you learned in the cardiovascular system was that arteries always go away from the heart. But in this case, we're talking about the fetal heart. Therefore, the umbilical vein is going to do the opposite. It's going to be going towards the fetal heart. So it takes oxygen to or toward the fetal heart. So those are going to be a little opposite of most blood vessels throughout the body, but these concepts still hold true. So arteries always go away, veins always go toward. So in addition to having these two blood vessels, we also have three vascular shunts. And the first one is called the ductus venosus, and it bypasses the liver. So the umbilical vein drains into this ductus venosus, and that empties into the inferior vena cava. So what happens here is blood is still flowing through the liver to keep the liver sinusoids, the cells in the liver functioning or receiving blood, but they're not playing their detoxification role that they will play after birth. So that ductus venosus is going to occlude at birth. Within the heart, we have two shunts. We have one called the foramen ovale, and that's an opening in their interatrial septum that bypasses pulmonary circulation. Also, the ductus arterius also bypasses pulmonary circulation, and the pulmonary trunk drains into the ductus arteriosus, which leads to the aorta. So it's sort of a bypass. So on our next slide, we can see these images shown really, really well. So we're first going to look at these adaptations in the fetus. So the placenta is going to be the site where the oxygen, nutrients, carbon dioxide, and waste are exchanged. So this would be on the fetal side of the placenta. So there's the umbilical arteries, which are deoxygenated blood, and one umbilical vein, which is oxygenated blood. This next bypass is for the liver. So we have the ductus venosus, which carries blood from the umbilical vein to the inferior vena cava, bypassing most of the liver capillaries. But again, those liver cells are still receiving, they're being exposed to blood. Before the lungs are inflated at birth, resistance to this blood flow through them is very high. So the blood pressure is higher in the right side of the heart than the left side. And that flips after birth. So here's the foramen ovale, and that's going to shunt blood from the right atrium to the left atrium to bypass the lungs. The ductus arteriosus is carrying blood from the pulmonary trunk to the aorta. So this is a simplified pathway of blood through the fetus. We have blood coming from the placenta via the umbilical vein. It goes through the liver, through the ductus venosus to the inferior vena cava to the right atrium. When it's in the right atrium, it goes directly to the left atrium through the foramen ovale. From the right ventricle, goes to the pulmonary trunk, but then bypasses the lungs through the ductus arteriosus to get to the left ventricle. When it leaves the heart, it goes out the aorta through the umbilical arteries, which, as you can see here, are going to go back away from the fetal heart to the placenta. At birth, this is what we now see. So, what happens at birth is that almost all of these are going to close within 30 minutes after birth, except for the foramen ovale. So, there are congenital heart defects where people actually still have an open foramen or slightly open foramen ovale. That's called a patent foramen ovale. I've actually had a student who still had one that was open, which is very rare. A lot of times they go in and they surgically close that after birth. So the ductus arteriosus, that is the bypass for the lungs that goes from the pulmonary trunk to the aorta. That's going to close after birth to become the ligamentum arteriosum. The foramen ovale should also close, but it may not close until a year after birth. But when it does, it becomes this depression in the interatrial septum called the fossa ovalis. The ductus venosus is the bypass through the liver. After birth, that's going to close and become the ligamentum venosum. Then the umbilical veins and the umbilical arteries are no longer going to be needed after the umbilicus is cut. So the umbilical vein becomes the ligamentum teres, and the umbilical artery becomes the median umbilical ligament. So you should know those different shunts. This slide is showing a summary of those different shunts. So again, we have the foramen ovale closing to become the fossa ovalis. This diverts blood from the right atrium to the left atrium. And this is the one that may close later than all of the others. And it's the one that sometimes they have to go in and surgically close. The next one is the ductus arteriosus. That becomes the ligamentum arteriosus, and it diverts blood from the pulmonary trunk to the aorta. The ductus venosus, it becomes the ligamentum venosum, and it carries blood from the umbilical vein through the liver into the inferior vena cava. The umbilical arteries become the median umbilical ligaments, and they carry blood from the fetus to the placenta. So remember, it's still away, but it's from the fetal heart. And the umbilical vein is just the opposite. It becomes the round ligament called the ligamentum teres, and it carries oxygenated blood from the fetus to the fetus. So again, it goes towards